15 years of marriage, and I thought I knew everything about my husband. Marcus and I had built what looked like the perfect life. We had a comfortable home, a quiet routine, and a son who meant everything to both of us. There had never been any major secrets between us. At least, that's what I believed. Then one afternoon, my son Ethan walked through the front door holding a small white envelope from school. Inside that envelope was a simple biology assignment, a DNA test. The project sounded harmless. The teacher wanted students to explore their ancestry and learn how genetics worked. Ethan was excited about it. He talked about discovering which countries our family originally came from and which traits he inherited from each of us. At first, I thought it was a wonderful idea. But 3 weeks later, when the results finally arrived, one line in that report changed everything. Because according to the DNA test, my husband had been lying to us for 15 years. And that was only the beginning. Because the deeper we looked into those results, the more impossible the situation became. There was another name in the report, a name none of us recognized, but according to the DNA data, that person was closely related to my son. Close enough to be family. At the time, I had no idea who that person was. I had no idea how they were connected to us, and I definitely didn't know why my husband suddenly looked terrified the moment he saw the results. But one thing became very clear in that moment. Marcus had known something about this DNA test long before we ever sent the sample. And whatever he was hiding, it was something he had kept secret for 15 years. But the truth behind that secret was far more complicated than I could have imagined, because it wasn't just about my husband. It was about a decision that had been made years earlier, without my knowledge, a decision that would eventually lead us to another family living hundreds of miles away. And when we finally discovered who they were, our lives would never be the same again. At first, the assignment seemed like nothing more than a small school project. Ethan placed the DNA kit on the kitchen table while explaining how the test worked. It was simple. Each student would swab the inside of their cheek, seal the sample in a container, and mail it to the testing company. A few weeks later, the results would reveal genetic markers, ancestry information, and inherited traits. Ethan thought it was fascinating. He talked excitedly about discovering which parts of the world our family came from. "Maybe we're part Italian," he said jokingly, "or maybe Viking." I smiled and listened while preparing dinner, not realizing that this tiny plastic test kit sitting on our table would soon expose something none of us were prepared for. That evening, Marcus came home from work a little later than usual. He looked tired, but that wasn't unusual. His job often kept him busy. Ethan immediately grabbed the DNA kit and showed it to him. "Dad, look what we're doing in biology class." Marcus glanced at the box casually at first, but the moment he read the words, DNA testing project, something changed. It was subtle. Most people probably wouldn't have noticed, but I did. For just a brief second, Marcus froze. His eyes lingered on the box longer than expected. Then he forced a small laugh. "DNA testing?" he said. "That seems a bit advanced for a school project." Ethan shrugged. "Our teacher says it helps us understand genetics." Marcus nodded slowly. "Right, genetics." His tone sounded strange, not angry, not upset, just uneasy. At the time, I assumed he was simply tired from work. But now, looking back, I realized something important. Marcus already knew that DNA test could reveal something dangerous, something he clearly didn't want anyone discovering. But none of us understood that yet. So the next morning, Ethan followed the instructions in the kit. He swabbed the inside of his cheek and sealed the sample in the container. Then we mailed it, just like every other student in his class. After that, life returned to normal. At least on the surface. Weeks passed. Ethan forgot about the project. Marcus stopped mentioning it, and I assumed the whole thing had simply faded into the background. But slowly, small things about Marcus began to feel different. He started asking Ethan strange questions about the project. How long until the results come back? Do the parents get to see the report? Does the teacher discuss it with the class? At first, those questions didn't seem unusual, But then Marcus asked something that immediately caught my attention. Do they compare the results with the parents' DNA? Ethan shook his head. No, I think it just shows ancestry and genetic traits. Marcus nodded quietly, but I noticed the tension in his face, and for the first time a small feeling of unease settled in the back of my mind. Why would Marcus be worried about a simple school DNA project? At the time, I brushed the thought aside, but a week later something happened that made it impossible to ignore. Marcus suggested something strange. He asked Ethan if he could skip presenting the project at school. That made no sense. Marcus had always encouraged Ethan to do well in school. He was the kind of father who proudly attended science fairs and school presentations. But now he was suddenly suggesting Ethan avoid the assignment completely. Ethan looked confused. But Dad, it's part of our grade. Marcus hesitated. Then he forced a smile. Right, of course. I was just thinking out loud. The conversation ended there. But that uneasy feeling inside me grew stronger. Something about Marcus's behavior wasn't normal. And deep down, I think he knew exactly what that DNA test might reveal. But none of us knew the truth yet, because the results were still weeks away. And when those results finally arrived, they would expose a secret that Marcus had managed to keep hidden for 15 years. But even that discovery wouldn't be the most shocking part, because the real mystery was something much bigger. Something buried inside the DNA report that none of us had expected to see. A name that didn't belong to anyone in our family, and somehow that name was connected to my son. 3 weeks passed before the results arrived. By then, the DNA project had almost completely slipped from our minds. Life had returned to its normal rhythm. Ethan went to school every morning. Marcus left early for work. I handled the small routines of our home that had remained unchanged for years. Nothing seemed different. But looking back now, I realized Marcus had started watching the mailbox more often. At first, I didn't notice it, but one afternoon I saw him standing by the front window, glancing toward the driveway. Expecting something? I asked casually. He looked slightly startled. No, he said quickly, just checking if the mail came. I didn't question it further. But 2 days later, the envelope finally arrived. It was sitting in the mailbox when Ethan got home from school. I heard him shout from the front porch, "Mom, the DNA results are here." He ran inside holding a white envelope with the testing company's logo printed across the front. His excitement filled the entire room. "Can we open it now?" Marcus was sitting on the couch when Ethan said that, and the moment he saw the envelope, his face changed. It happened so quickly that if I had blinked, I might have missed it. His expression tightened. Not anger, not fear exactly, but something very close to panic. Still, Marcus forced a calm smile. "Sure," he said. "Let's see what it says." Ethan tore the envelope open immediately. Inside was a printed report along with a link to view the full results online. He spread the papers across the dining table. At first, everything seemed normal. The report showed Ethan's ancestry percentages. There were sections explaining genetic traits, inherited markers, and regions of the world connected to our family history. Ethan laughed when he saw one of the results. "Look at this. It says I might have Scandinavian ancestry." Marcus nodded quietly. "That's interesting." But I noticed something strange. Marcus wasn't actually looking at the ancestry results. His eyes were moving across the report as if he were searching for something specific, almost like he already knew what he might find. Then Ethan flipped to another page. "Mom," he said, pointing at the paper. "What does this part mean?" I walked over and leaned beside him. It was a section labeled Genetic Relationship Indicators. The report explained how certain DNA markers could suggest biological connections with other individuals in the testing database. Most of the time, these matches were distant relatives, second cousins, third cousins. Sometimes people discovered relatives they had never met before. It wasn't unusual. But then Ethan pointed at a name listed near the top of the page. "Who is this?" I looked closer. And that was the moment something inside me felt suddenly wrong, because the name listed there didn't belong to anyone in our family. The report showed a very high genetic match with someone named Lucas Carter. The percentage was unusually strong, strong enough to suggest something far closer than a distant relative, possibly a half-sibling. I felt my stomach tighten as I read the explanation printed beside the name. According to the report, Lucas Carter shared nearly 50% of Ethan's DNA. That level of similarity only happens in very specific relationships: a parent, a sibling, or a half-brother. Ethan looked confused. "Do we know anyone named Lucas?" I shook my head slowly. "No." But before I could say anything else, I noticed Marcus standing behind us. He had been completely silent, and when I turned to look at him, the color had drained from his face. Marcus was staring at the report like someone who had just seen a ghost. That was the moment I knew something was very wrong. Because Marcus didn't look surprised. He looked like a man who had just realized a secret he buried years ago had finally come back to find him. But the strangest part was still ahead. Because as I read further down the report, I noticed something else, something that made absolutely no sense. According to the genetic markers listed in the analysis, Marcus could not be Ethan's biological father. For a few seconds after reading that line in the report, nobody said anything. The room felt strangely quiet. Ethan was still sitting at the table, looking back and forth between Marcus and me. "Wait," he said slowly. "What does that mean?" I forced myself to look at the paper again, hoping I had misunderstood something, but the wording was clear. The DNA markers listed in the report showed no biological connection between Marcus and Ethan. It didn't make sense. Marcus had been there the day Ethan was born. He had held him in his arms before anyone else. He had raised him for 15 years. How could a DNA test suddenly say something completely different? "There must be a mistake," I said quickly. Ethan nodded. "Yeah, maybe they mixed up the samples." Marcus spoke for the first time since we opened the report. "Yes," he said firmly. "That has to be it." His voice sounded confident, but his eyes told a different story. Marcus looked like a man who had just seen something he had hoped would never appear. I turned the page again, studying the results carefully. The explanation section repeated the same conclusion. The probability of Marcus being Ethan's biological father was 0%. 0. I felt a cold sensation spread through my chest. That kind of error didn't happen easily in DNA testing. Still, I didn't want to jump to conclusions. "There's an easy way to clear this up," I said, trying to stay calm. "We can just run another test." Ethan agreed immediately. "Yeah, the teacher said sometimes they do confirmation tests." Marcus didn't respond. He was staring at the table. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded quieter. "Another test won't change anything." That sentence hung in the air. I frowned. "What do you mean?" Marcus hesitated. Then he shook his head. "Nothing. I just mean, if it's a mistake, the second test will show it." His words sounded reasonable, but something about the way he said them felt wrong. Almost like he already knew what the second test would reveal. I picked up the report again and looked back at the name listed in the genetic match section. Lucas Carter. The report explained that Lucas shared nearly half of Ethan's DNA. That level of similarity meant one thing. They were almost certainly half-brothers, which raised an impossible question. If Marcus wasn't Ethan's biological father, then who was? And more importantly, who was Lucas Carter? Ethan leaned closer to the paper. "Maybe Lucas is just some cousin or something." But the percentage listed beside the name said otherwise. 50%. That wasn't cousin-level similarity. That was family. Close family. Marcus suddenly stood up. "I think we're reading too much into this," he said. "DNA tests can be wrong." I looked at him carefully. "You seemed worried about this test weeks ago." He froze, only for a moment, but long enough for me to notice. "What do you mean?" he asked. "You asked Ethan if he could skip the project." Marcus forced a small laugh. "I was joking," but I could feel the tension in the room growing. Ethan looked confused. "So, what do we do now?" I folded the report slowly. We order another DNA test. Marcus didn't argue this time, but his silence felt heavier than words, because deep down, I had a growing suspicion. Marcus wasn't afraid of the test being wrong. He was afraid of the test confirming the truth. But none of us were prepared for what would happen next. Because the second DNA test didn't just confirm the results, it uncovered something even stranger, something that made the entire situation far more complicated than we imagined. And it all began with a message that arrived 2 days later. A message from someone named Lucas Carter. The house felt strangely tense after that conversation. Even though none of us said it out loud, the DNA report had changed something between us. Ethan went upstairs to finish his homework, still confused about what the results meant. Marcus stayed in the living room, pretending to watch television. But I could tell his mind was somewhere else. He kept glancing toward the dining table where the DNA report still lay folded beside Ethan's backpack. And every time he looked at it, his expression tightened. I picked up the paper again and stared at the name printed there. Lucas Carter. It felt strange seeing a name connected to my son that I had never heard before. And yet, according to the report, Lucas shared nearly half of Ethan's DNA. That meant the connection between them wasn't distant. It was immediate, direct, which raised a question I couldn't stop thinking about. If Marcus wasn't Ethan's biological father, then somewhere out there was a man who was. And if Lucas Carter was Ethan's half-brother, then that meant there was another family connected to ours in a way we didn't understand. But none of us knew how real that possibility was yet. Because at that moment, Lucas Carter was just a name printed on a report. At least, that's what I thought, until 2 days later. That afternoon, I was sitting in the kitchen checking my email when I noticed a notification from the DNA testing website. At first, I assumed it was just an update about the report, but when I opened the message, I felt my heart skip. The notification said something unexpected. You have received a message from a genetic match. I stared at the screen. A genetic match. There was only one person listed in the report with that level of connection. My hands suddenly felt cold as I clicked the message. And there it was. A short note from someone named Lucas Carter. The message was simple, but the moment I read it, everything inside me tightened. It said, "Hello, I think we might be related. My DNA report shows a very strong match with Ethan. I was wondering if your family knows how we might be connected." I sat there staring at the screen for several seconds. Because Lucas Carter wasn't just a name on a report anymore. He was a real person. And somehow, he believed he was related to my son. I heard Marcus walking into the kitchen behind me. "Anything interesting?" he asked casually. I turned the laptop toward him. "You should read this." Marcus leaned closer, and the moment his eyes reached the name Lucas Carter, his entire posture changed. His shoulders stiffened. His face went pale. It was the exact same reaction he had when he first saw the DNA report. Marcus read the message silently. Then he straightened up quickly. "We shouldn't respond," he said. The answer came too fast, too defensive. "Why not?" I asked. Marcus hesitated. Then he shrugged. "It's probably just a coincidence. Those DNA websites make mistakes all the time." But I knew that wasn't the real reason, because Marcus didn't look like someone dealing with a coincidence. He looked like someone watching a secret slowly come back to life. And the more I thought about it, the more something about this situation started to bother me. Marcus had been nervous about the DNA test from the very beginning, before the results even arrived, before we knew about Lucas Carter, which meant there was only one possible explanation. Marcus already knew something about this, something connected to that DNA test, and whatever that secret was, it had started long before Ethan ever brought that assignment home from school. But I didn't know the truth yet. Because the real story behind Lucas Carter was still buried 15 years in the past, and Marcus had spent all that time making sure no one ever discovered it. But now the secret had found its way back into our lives. And the next message Lucas sent would make it impossible for Marcus to keep hiding the truth any longer. Because Lucas Carter didn't just want to know if he was related to Ethan, he wanted to meet him. I didn't respond to Lucas immediately. Part of me wanted to ignore the message entirely, just like Marcus suggested. But another part of me couldn't stop thinking about it. Because if the DNA results were correct, Lucas Carter wasn't just a stranger, he was somehow connected to my son. That meant there was a story behind that connection. And the more I thought about Marcus's reaction to the test, the more I felt certain of one thing. Marcus knew that story. He just wasn't telling me. That evening, I sat in the living room scrolling through the DNA report again, reading every line more carefully than before. Marcus had gone upstairs earlier than usual. He said he had work emails to answer, but I had a feeling he simply wanted to avoid the conversation we both knew was coming. The report didn't reveal much about Lucas beyond the genetic connection, but the website allowed users to view basic profile information from their DNA matches. So I clicked on Lucas Carter's profile. A small photo appeared on the screen. It showed a teenage boy standing outside, smiling at the camera. He looked about the same age as Ethan, maybe a year older. But what caught my attention wasn't his age. It was his face. There was something familiar about it. I couldn't explain why at first, but the longer I looked at the photo, the more a strange feeling settled over me. Lucas didn't just look like a random stranger. In some ways, he looked like Ethan. Not exactly the same, but similar enough to make my chest tighten. I leaned back in my chair, trying to process what I was seeing. Two boys, both teenagers, both connected through DNA. And according to the report, they shared nearly half their genetic markers, which meant the explanation had to be simple. They shared a biological parent, but that parent clearly wasn't Marcus, which meant the truth had to be something else, something I hadn't considered before. I closed the laptop and sat quietly for several minutes. Then I walked upstairs. Marcus was sitting at his desk pretending to work on his laptop. But the moment I entered the room, I knew he hadn't been focusing on anything. He looked up immediately. "We need to talk," I said. Marcus sighed softly. "About the DNA thing?" "Yes." He closed the laptop slowly. "What do you want to know?" I stared at him for a moment before answering. "The truth." Marcus didn't respond. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and rubbed his hands together like someone trying to buy time. "Marcus," I said quietly, "you were worried about that test weeks ago, before the results even arrived." He looked down at the floor. "You knew something could come out of it." Silence filled the room. And in that silence, I realized something important. Marcus wasn't surprised by the results. He had been expecting them. "Is Ethan really your son?" I asked. Marcus's head snapped up. "What kind of question is that?" "The kind that deserves an honest answer." Marcus stood up and walked toward the window. For a long time, he said nothing. Then he spoke quietly. "I raised Ethan," he said. "That wasn't the question." Another long pause followed. Then Marcus turned slowly toward me. And for the first time since this whole situation began, he looked like a man carrying something heavy. Something he had been holding on to for years. "I didn't tell you everything about Ethan's birth," he said. My heart started pounding. "What does that mean?" Marcus ran a hand through his hair nervously. "It means things didn't happen exactly the way you think they did." That sentence alone was enough to make my stomach twist, because suddenly all the pieces started moving in a direction I hadn't considered before. The DNA results. Lucas Carter. Marcus's fear of the test. It all pointed towards something that had happened long before Ethan was even born. But Marcus wasn't ready to say it yet. He looked at me carefully. "There's something you need to understand first." "What?" Marcus took a deep breath. 15 years ago, we were having trouble starting a family. And the moment he said that, I felt a chill run down my spine. Because suddenly I realized exactly where this conversation might be heading. But what Marcus revealed next would make the situation far more complicated than I imagined. Because Ethan wasn't the only child connected to that decision we made 15 years ago. There were others. And one of them was Lucas Carter. For several seconds after Marcus mentioned our struggle to start a family, neither of us spoke. I already knew exactly what he was referring to. 15 years ago, before Ethan was born, Marcus and I had spent nearly 2 years trying to have a child. At first, we assumed it was just taking longer than expected, but after several doctor visits, the truth became difficult to ignore. Something wasn't working the way it should. Eventually, our doctor suggested that Marcus undergo a few medical tests. Those results came back weeks later. And according to Marcus, everything had been fine. At least that's what he told me at the time. But now, standing in that bedroom 15 years later, something about his words made my stomach tighten. "You said the tests were normal," I reminded him quietly. Marcus nodded slowly. "That's what I told you." The way he said it made the meaning painfully clear. "That's what you told me?" I repeated. Marcus looked away. "I didn't tell you the whole truth." The room suddenly felt smaller. "What truth?" Marcus took a long breath before answering. "The tests showed that I couldn't have children." For a moment, the words didn't fully register. I just stared at him, trying to process what he had said. "You told me everything was fine." "I know." "Marcus, you said there was nothing wrong." "I know," he repeated quietly. My chest tightened as memories from 15 years ago came rushing back. All those doctor appointments, all those conversations about starting a family. The night Marcus told me the tests looked good, and now he was telling me something completely different. "You lied to me," I said. Marcus didn't argue. "Yes." Silence filled the room again, and suddenly the DNA test started making a lot more sense. But it also raised another question. "If you couldn't have children," I said slowly, "then how did I get pregnant with Ethan?" Marcus rubbed his hands together nervously. "That's the part I never told you." My heart began pounding again. "What did you do, Marcus?" He hesitated. Then he finally said the words. "I went back to the doctor without telling you." I felt a chill run through my body. "You went alone?" "Yes." "And?" Marcus took another breath. "The doctor suggested another option." I already knew what that option probably was, but hearing Marcus say it out loud made everything feel real. "They recommended using a donor." For a moment, I couldn't even speak. "You're saying Ethan was conceived using a sperm donor?" Marcus nodded slowly. But you didn't tell me?" "I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" "That you might not want to go through with it," he admitted. "So you made that decision for both of us?" Marcus lowered his head. "I thought I was protecting our marriage." But the more he spoke, the more something about the situation didn't add up, because donor programs were usually anonymous, carefully controlled. They didn't suddenly connect families 15 years later. "Even if that's true," I said carefully, "that still doesn't explain Lucas Carter." Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, and the expression on his face told me something else was still missing from the story. "You're right," he said quietly. "There's another part." My stomach tightened again. "What part?" Marcus looked at me with the same uneasy expression he had worn the day Ethan brought home the DNA kit. "The clinic made a mistake." Those words sent a cold wave through my chest. "What kind of mistake?" Marcus hesitated before answering. "The donor they used wasn't supposed to be used that many times." I frowned. "What does that mean?" Marcus swallowed hard. "It means the same donor fathered multiple children." The room felt silent again. "How many?" Marcus shook his head slowly. "I don't know." And suddenly the situation felt much bigger than just one DNA test. Because if Marcus was telling the truth, then Lucas Carter wasn't just some random match. He was another child conceived from that same donor. Another teenager living somewhere out there who shared half of Ethan's DNA. But even that wasn't the most unsettling part, because the next message Lucas sent would reveal something far stranger. Something that suggested the clinic's mistake might have been much bigger than Marcus realized. And when I read that message the following morning, I realized Ethan and Lucas might not be the only ones connected to that donor. Not even close. I didn't sleep much that night. Marcus's confession kept replaying in my mind over and over again. For 15 years, I had believed we started our family naturally, but now I knew the truth. Marcus had secretly agreed to use a donor. And because of that decision, Ethan shared DNA with a boy named Lucas Carter, a boy none of us had ever met. The next morning, I opened the DNA website again. Lucas had sent another message overnight. This one was longer, and by the time I finished reading it, I realized this situation was even more complicated than we thought. Lucas wrote that he had taken the DNA test for the same reason Ethan had, a school project. At first, his results had only shown a few distant relatives, but then something unexpected appeared. A strong match. Ethan. Lucas said the similarity had surprised him enough that he started doing some research. He joined a few online forums where people discussed donor-conceived families, and that's when he discovered something that made the situation much bigger than we realized. There were others. Several other teenagers had reported similar DNA matches connected to the same donor. Lucas listed 3 names in his message, 3 different people from different states, all showing genetic markers that pointed to the same biological father. I stared at the screen, trying to absorb what that meant. If Lucas was correct, then Ethan didn't just have one half-brother, he might have several. Children scattered across the country who all came from the same donor. Children who had grown up in completely different families without ever knowing about each other. I leaned back in my chair, suddenly overwhelmed by the idea. Marcus walked into the kitchen a few minutes later. He immediately noticed the expression on my face. "What is it?" he asked. I turned the laptop toward him. "Lucas sent another message." Marcus read the email slowly. With every line, his expression grew more serious. When he finished reading, he sat down across from me. "That's impossible," he said quietly. "But it's not," I replied. "The DNA results already proved Ethan and Lucas are related." Marcus rubbed his forehead. This isn't how donor programs are supposed to work." Lucas's message ended with something else. A request. He wanted to meet Ethan, not right away, but eventually. He said he understood if we needed time to process everything, but he also wrote something that stayed in my mind long after I closed the message. "I've spent my whole life wondering where I came from. It would mean a lot just to talk." That sentence made the entire situation feel very real, because Lucas wasn't just a name on a screen anymore. He was a teenager trying to understand his own identity, just like Ethan. And somehow, through a decision made 15 years ago, our lives had become connected. Marcus remained quiet for a long time. Finally, he looked at me. "What are you thinking?" I answered honestly. "I think Ethan deserves to know the truth." Marcus nodded slowly. I agree." That conversation with Ethan happened later that evening. We explained everything carefully. Marcus admitted that he had hidden the truth about the donor, and we told Ethan about Lucas. At first, Ethan didn't know how to react. The idea of suddenly having a half-brother was difficult to process, but after a while he asked a simple question. "Is Lucas my age?" "Almost," I said. Ethan sat quietly for a moment, then he shrugged. "That's kind of weird." Marcus smiled faintly. "Yes, it is." But then Ethan said something none of us expected. "Can I talk to him?" Marcus and I looked at each other. "Are you sure?" I asked. Ethan nodded. "If he's my brother, I want to know what he's like." And just like that, the situation moved in a direction none of us had imagined when that DNA test first arrived. Because a few days later, Ethan and Lucas would speak to each other for the first time, but that conversation would reveal something none of us had expected, something Lucas had discovered while researching the donor, a piece of information that suggested the fertility clinic's mistake might have been much larger than Marcus realized. And when Lucas told us what he had found, it would change the entire story of Ethan's birth. The first conversation between Ethan and Lucas happened 3 days later. Neither of them seemed nervous at first, at least not on the surface, but the entire situation felt strange. 2 teenagers who had never met before were about to speak to each other because of a DNA test that had been meant for a simple school project. Marcus set up the video call on the laptop, while Ethan sat quietly beside me at the kitchen table. When the screen finally connected, Lucas appeared. He looked exactly like the photo from his profile, same dark hair, same calm expression, and the moment Ethan saw him, he leaned forward slightly, because the resemblance between them was suddenly much more obvious in motion. It wasn't identical, but there were similarities in the shape of their faces and the way their expressions changed when they spoke. Lucas smiled first. "Hi." Ethan gave a small wave. "Hi." For a moment, both of them seemed unsure what to say. Then Lucas spoke again. "This is weird, right?" Ethan laughed softly. "Yeah, a little." But the awkwardness didn't last long. Teenagers have a way of adjusting quickly to unusual situations. Within a few minutes, they were asking each other normal questions. What school they attended, what sports they liked, what kind of music they listened to. Marcus and I stayed nearby, but mostly let them talk, because it was clear that whatever this situation meant, it belonged to them as much as it did to us. After a while, Lucas mentioned something that immediately caught my attention. "I've been doing some research about the donor," he said. Ethan looked curious. "What donor?" Lucas paused. "You didn't know?" Marcus stepped closer. "We told Ethan about the donor 2 days ago." Lucas nodded slowly. "That's when I found out too." Ethan leaned closer to the screen. "What did you find?" Lucas hesitated for a moment before answering. "Well, it turns out there are more of us." The kitchen fell quiet again. "How many?" Ethan asked. Lucas shook his head. I'm not sure yet." He explained that several people on the DNA website had started connecting their results together. Some of them had similar genetic matches. Others shared small pieces of family history connected to the same fertility clinic. But the most surprising discovery came from someone who had taken the test years earlier. That person had managed to trace the donor's identity. Marcus frowned. "I thought donor programs were anonymous." "They usually are," Lucas said, "but sometimes records get leaked." My heart started beating faster. "You're saying someone found the donor?" Lucas nodded. "Maybe." Marcus leaned forward. "Maybe?" Lucas looked uncertain. "They think they know who he is." The room felt silent again. Because if someone had actually discovered the donor's identity, that meant something none of us had expected. The mystery of Ethan's biological father might actually be solvable, but Lucas continued speaking. "And there's something else." Ethan looked confused. "What?" Lucas hesitated before answering. "The donor might not even know about all of us." Marcus looked stunned. "What do you mean?" Lucas explained that according to the forum discussions, the donor had originally signed an agreement allowing the clinic to use his sample a limited number of times. But the number of genetic matches appearing online suggested something very different. The samples might have been used far more than originally promised, which meant dozens of families could be connected to the same donor. Families who had no idea their children shared the same biological father. The realization slowly settled over the room. This situation wasn't just about Ethan and Lucas anymore. It might involve many more people. Marcus leaned back in his chair. "That clinic said everything was handled carefully." Lucas nodded. "Maybe it was, at first." Then he said something that made the entire situation feel even stranger. "The donor lives in this state." Ethan blinked. "Wait, really?" Lucas nodded again. "Yeah." My heart started pounding again, because suddenly the mystery wasn't just some distant story happening somewhere else. The man who shared DNA with my son might actually be living nearby. Someone who had never met Ethan. Someone who might not even know Ethan existed. But the biggest surprise of all came from Ethan. He looked directly at the screen and asked Lucas a question none of us had expected. "Do you think we should meet him?" Marcus and I exchanged a quick glance, because that question opened a door none of us were prepared to walk through. But the answer Lucas gave would push the story in a direction none of us had imagined. Because according to Lucas, someone had already tried. And what they discovered about the donor made the entire situation far more complicated than we expected. After that first video call ended, the house felt unusually quiet. Ethan went upstairs to his room, still processing everything he had learned. Marcus and I remained in the kitchen, sitting across from each other without saying much. The past few days had turned our lives upside down. A school assignment had exposed a secret Marcus had hidden for 15 years, and now we knew that Ethan wasn't just connected to one stranger named Lucas Carter. He might be connected to several people we had never met, all because of a decision Marcus made long before Ethan was born. But the question Lucas raised during that conversation still lingered in my mind. Someone had already tried to find the donor, and whatever they discovered had complicated everything. The next day, Lucas sent another message. This time he shared a link to a discussion forum where several people connected to the same donor had been communicating. Some of them were parents. Others were teenagers like Lucas who had taken DNA tests out of curiosity. And buried deep in that discussion thread was a piece of information that finally explained what had happened. One of the parents had managed to obtain old medical records connected to the fertility clinic Marcus had used. According to those documents, the donor had originally agreed to allow his sample to be used for no more than 10 families. That limit was supposed to prevent situations exactly like this. But over time, the clinic had quietly expanded the program. The same donor sample had been used again and again, possibly dozens of times, and the donor himself had never been told. Which meant somewhere out there was a man who had unknowingly become the biological father of children he had never met. Children growing up in different homes, different cities, and different families. Children like Ethan, children like Lucas. Marcus read through the information carefully. Then he closed the laptop slowly. "I never knew any of this," he said quietly. I believed him. 15 years ago, we had trusted the clinic completely. We believed everything had been handled responsibly. But now it seemed the situation had been far more complicated than we ever realized. Later that evening, Ethan came downstairs and sat beside me on the couch. He looked thoughtful but calm. "So, what happens now?" he asked. Marcus answered first. "That depends on what you want." Ethan leaned back and thought about it for a moment. Then he said something simple. "I think I'd like to meet Lucas." Marcus nodded. "I think that's a good idea." And a few weeks later, that meeting finally happened. Lucas and his parents drove to our city on a Saturday afternoon. The moment Ethan and Lucas saw each other in person, both of them laughed, because standing side by side, the similarities between them were impossible to ignore. They weren't identical, but anyone who looked closely could see they shared something deeper than coincidence. The afternoon felt surprisingly natural. The boys talked about school, sports, and the strange way they had discovered each other. Marcus and I spoke with Lucas's parents, who had experienced the same shock we did when the DNA results appeared. None of us had expected our families to intersect this way, but somehow it felt right that they had. Before Lucas left that evening, Ethan said something that stayed with me long afterward. "Well, I guess I finally got a brother," Lucas smiled. "Yeah, I guess you did." In the end, the DNA test that had started as a simple school project didn't destroy our family the way I first feared it might. It revealed secrets. It forced Marcus and me to confront the truth about choices made years earlier, but it also did something unexpected. It connected our lives to people we never would have met otherwise. Of people who, in a strange and complicated way, had always been part of our story. And sometimes the truth that changes everything also creates something new. Something you never expected. A bigger family than you ever imagined. Do you think Marcus should have told the truth about the donor from the beginning, or do you understand why he kept it secret for 15 years? Let me know what you would have done in the comments. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to Mind Tales by Kiyomi for more powerful real-life stories.